Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of our flagship report, Health Equals Wealth, Maximising the Global Longevity Dividend. A year ago, we published a UK report called the Longevity Dividend, which highlighted the contributions of older people in terms of work, in terms of spending, in terms of volunteering and caring. And we're today delighted to be publishing an updated version that looks across the whole of the G20. And we wanted to do this ahead of the G20 finance ministers and central bankers meeting later this week. I should say very quickly, I'm very grateful to Sanofi and Legal & General for their support to make this possible. And before we get started, there are a few housekeeping rules to go through. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat function. You can chat with the panelists and delegates. There's also a Q&A feature where we'll be collecting some comments as well. So please do add your comments there. If you do get disconnected, please use the same link that you used to join this conference, and that will connect you back in. We'd encourage you to post comments on Twitter using the Longevity Dividend hashtag and ILC UK. And to let you know, again, if the webinar is being recorded and published on our YouTube channel, so is currently streaming live on there, so you can also connect in there. As the world ages, older people are increasingly important consumers, workers, carers, volunteers. But what I don't want to steal too much of Sophia's thunder, but actually what we do know is poor health is a barrier to maximising this economic contribution. Today we are going to launch our new report and share our findings on what the value of the longevity economy is across the G20. But also highlight our new analysis highlights the role of health in delivering this longevity dividend. And then finally, I think we have quite a big narrative in our report about the role for global policymakers to unlock some of this potential dividend. We're going to be hearing from we're very fortunate to have a brilliant panel of speakers from across the world joining us today. As I say, we're very keen to have your views and hear from you in the Q&A session. Please do submit any questions or thoughts there, but also, as I said, put them onto Twitter. So today we will kick off with my colleague Sophie Dimitriadis, who will talk about the report. Then delighted that we have Dr. Mukisi, the South African Health Minister. We have contributions from Eric Hagen, who last joined an ILC UK event in Japan last October and is the American Deputy Health Secretary. Dubravka Šuica, who will be talking about the Green Paper, the EU work. And then we have Mark Pearson of OECD and Gustavo DeMarco at the World Bank, who again will be talking about their work and responding to our paper. So I am going to immediately stop there and pass over to my colleague Sophia to talk through our findings.
Thank you, David. Yes, as mentioned, my name's Sophia. I'm a research fellow at the ILC, and I'll talk about the key findings of our report. And I just want to thank Sanofi and Legal & General for making this possible. Next slide, please. So just a bit about the key messages. We too often fixate on the economic costs of aging, so we have a very negative view around aging in the economy. But what we find is that the economic and social contributions of older adults are actually significant. So this is from working and earning, spending their earnings, but also from generating unpaid contributions like volunteering in the community, caring for loved ones who are unwell, and looking after grandchildren. And these are not only significant, they're actually growing as our populations age. But we find that we can do more to maximize these. We find there's significant variation in these contributions and trends across countries. So there's opportunities to learn from this. We also know that there's avoidable barriers that hinder older people's ability to contribute from previous research. And so there's something we can do about that. And addressing these barriers could be really beneficial. Firstly, they can help to address the economic challenges of aging. And secondly, they can benefit us all as we age. We do know from previous research that if people are able to choose to do these activities and they do engage with them in later life, they can benefit health and well-being and give us more freedom as we age to do what we want to do. But we do find that there's a key barrier to all of these contributions, and that is poor health. and good health can actually unlock all of these contributions. Health equals wealth, and that's something we'll focus on a lot in the report. And we find that preventing ill health is key to maximizing that link and key to maximizing the longevity dividend. So next slide, please. So what we find if we turn to the labour market firstly, we see that people are increasingly working at older ages. And since 2001, employment rates at ages 50 to 69 actually grew across the G20. And by 2035, 65% of this age group may actually be in work, which means they'd nearly catch up with employment rates at younger age groups. So there's a lot of fast growing trends here. And we see these trends in most G20 economies, but not in every single one. So in some economies, we're actually seeing opposite trends happening. So there's opportunities to learn from this. And it's also important to note that this will benefit all generations. So there's often this misperception that older people working for longer actually takes away the jobs from younger people. But that is actually a fallacy, because what we know is that if older people are working for longer, they're spending more, and they're spending to support the job opportunities of people across all ages and across the economy. And there's a lot of evidence to support that. Next slide, please. And what we see is that as older people are working for longer and as our populations are aging, the share of the workforce also is aging. The workforce is also aging. And we find that the share of the workforce age 50 and over is actually increasing in all G20 economies. And already around 30% of the workforce is age 50 and over. And this could be 40% by 2035. So we will be more reliant on an older workforce going forward. So we might want to ask ourselves, how can we maximize older workers' productivity? How can we ensure they're getting the right training opportunities? Because currently we know that older workers generally receive less training opportunities than younger workers. We also need to consider how can we ensure that older people and older workers are fulfilled at work. That is important in and of itself, but also to maximize productivity. Next slide, please. And so what we find is that these workforce trends mean that the earnings of older people are significant and growing. So on average across the G20, every third dollar is actually earned by someone aged 50 and over. And we can see that these earnings are actually accounting for a growing share of the economy over time. So that's a growing share of total earnings and of GDP. And people aged 50 and over could actually earn every $4 in $10 earned in overall by 2035. But these trends over time do vary across economies. So while they're happening in most G20 economies, they're not happening in all. So in Turkey, we're seeing, for instance, earnings generated by older people are actually falling as a share of the overall economy. Next slide, please. But this contrasts to the EU, where we are seeing older people's earnings accounting for a growing share of total earnings and GDP in nearly all EU countries except Romania. And this variation might actually be linked to longer working lives. So for instance, in Romania and Turkey, employment rates at older ages have actually been falling in recent years. And so that might mean that their earnings are becoming less important to the economy. So we really see the importance of supporting people to work for longer, to be able to generate and support GDP via earned income. And we can learn from Iceland here. They have exceptionally high employment rates at older ages. And we find that if we enable older people to work across the G20 at the same rates as Iceland, for people aged 50 and over, this could add around $3.7 trillion to GDP. That averages around 7% of GDP across each G20 economy. So there really is a huge economic prize from supporting people to work for longer and reducing any barriers that prevent this. Next slide, please. And so if we turn to older people's spending, we can see that older household spending is significant. It already averages around 56% of household spending overall. So that's over half of overall household spending, or 22% of GDP. And this spending is actually growing over time. And it's also becoming more important for the overall consumer market. So older people's market share, consumer market share, is growing. And this is because, firstly, there are more older consumers, so our population is aging, but also each older consumer on average is actually spending more over time. And that's likely because they're working for longer and they're earning more. So both of these trends are occurring. But the key point here is that our economies are increasingly becoming reliant on older consumers. So that's something for businesses to take note. There's a huge opportunity to adapt to this demographic, to innovate, but also to make sure existing goods and services are inclusive to people of all ages and health needs. But it's also something for governments to take note. So if they want to support consumption in their economies, they will need to consider and support older people to be able to consume and reduce any barriers to this. And that's also relevant while we try and recover and support our economies to recover because of COVID. Next slide, please. And if we look at older households spend... Pardon?
Maybe after the presentation.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's fine. Because
Hello? Shall I go? Sorry. So if we look at older people's spending, we actually can see it's sizable on a global scale. So we see that in 2015, older households spent around 9.7 trillion US dollars in total. And that actually exceeds the GDP of Japan, Australia, Canada, and Brazil combined. So this represents a huge export market. It's really an exciting opportunity for businesses. And we can see that a lot of sectors will benefit from older people's spending growth. And that includes housing and utilities, recreation and culture, transport and health, where these are the fastest growing sectors in a number of countries in the G20. Next slide, please. So if we now turn to unpaid contributions, we also see that these are significant. And they're particularly significant in terms of the contributions generated by people aged 65 and over, where this age group actually spend more time on average compared to other ages volunteering in the community or caring for a loved one who was unwell at home. And I think this is really interesting because we know after the age of 65, people generally, there's a strong shift where people leave the labour market. So market contributions fall quite significantly, but we can see that people are still contributing just via these unpaid contributions, and they're doing so more so on average than people at younger ages. Next slide, please. And although these unpaid contributions aren't measured in GDP, we find that if they were, we would realise how significant they are. So we note that the unpaid contributions by people aged 50 and over in the EU and Turkey actually average around 1.4% of GDP. And that exceeds the spending that the EU spends on defence. So that's really quite significant. And similarly, the unpaid contributions of people aged 65 and over amount to around 0.7% of GDP. And again, that's over half of what the EU spends on defence. And what's interesting to note is that in many countries, the economic value of unpaid contributions at ages 65 and over actually exceed this age group's market contributions. So in Germany, they're over double their market contributions. So what this means is that if we fail to take these into account, we massively underestimate the full contributions of older adults. We have a very distorted picture. We don't take into their full contributions into account. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we've seen this variation in contributions across country and their value to our economy and society. So what is key to enabling this? Well, we find that good health may be particularly key. Of course, there are a lot of factors that affect these, but good health is particularly key. So what we find is that older people in better health are more likely to be in work, volunteer often and spend more time volunteering, and also spend more in the economy. And this pattern is found across countries. And so what is important to note here is that health is important both for market and for non-market activities. So it can really underpin a longevity dividend. Next slide, please. We also see that health may be a key factor in explaining the variation in older people's economic impact across countries. So it's important at a country level, and this is health, but also investment in health. So what we find is that employment rates and rates of spending at older ages are higher in countries that spend more on health as a share of GDP, have higher flu vaccination rates at older ages. So that's an example of a specific preventative health intervention. And they also have healthier older populations. We also find that older people spend more time volunteering in countries that spend more on health and where older people are healthier. And similarly, older people are more likely to spend more time looking after grandchildren in countries with healthier older populations. So again, we're seeing that health and investment in health is important for both market activities, but also non-market activities. Next slide, please. And so what we're seeing here is a strong link between health and wealth, and that's a link we too often forget. But to maximize that link, we need to invest in prevention, preventive health spending not only lowers treatment costs, so it's a more efficient way to benefit health, it actually supports the wider economy, and it's a more efficient way to do this. So to give you an example, if we can prevent somebody from having a health shock that induces them to leave the labour market early, that is the best way to maximise the link between health and wealth. And we do find that preventative health spending is actually really associated with many of these contributions across countries. So to give you an example, an increase in preventative health spending by just 0.1 percentage points is associated with a 9% increase in spending by older people per year. And to put this in perspective, this would add around $180 billion to the US economy in 2015, or around 1% of GDP. Similarly, that increase in preventative spending is also associated with 10 more volunteer hours per older person per year. And that would amount to around a 50% increase in the average annual hours volunteered by older people in Europe. So we're really seeing the potential of preventative health spending to unlock the social and economic contributions of older adults. Next slide, please. It's important to note that investment in prevention is indeed an investment, and it would actually pay for itself. And so a recent report by McKinsey estimated that there would be an economic return of around $2 to $4 for every dollar invested in improving global health, mainly via known preventative health interventions. And that's by taking into account the impact of good health and enabling people to work. So that link between health and wealth means that this is very cost effective. Next slide, please. But we need to do more. And what we find is that preventative health spending is far too low. So while in Canada, they spend around 6% of their health budgets on prevention, in most G20 economies, this is less than 2.5%. And in many countries, it's far lower than this. We're really not doing enough. And we also find that these budgets are the first to be cut in times of crises, while this needs to be increasing as our populations age and preventable illnesses likely become more common. We also note that health inequalities are wide and growing in some countries. And this is really worrying because it's the most disadvantaged groups that would benefit the most from health interventions. And it is these groups that are the furthest away from realizing their full social and economic potential. However, we have found that the tragedy of COVID may have actually strengthened the case for investing in prevention. It might be a unique moment to push for this. So we know that this has really exposed the link between health and wealth. We've seen economies decimated because of the virus. We also know that countries who have healthier populations, so for instance, have lower obesity rates, may actually be more resilient to the virus. So there's a short-term incentive to invest in prevention. And we also know that while health is particularly key to unlock these contributions, there are other barriers. So for instance, previous research has identified that non-inclusive products, services, town centres and communities like workplaces and volunteering opportunities can hinder older people's ability to spend, work, volunteer and support their wider communities. So we need to ensure these are inclusive to all ages and health needs. We also know that while many G20 members are doing a lot to support aging populations, they're doing some really interesting policies, generally these policies are really fragmented. And we note that G20 leaders' commitments in aging actually constitute only 0.35% of the overall G20's commitments in total. And so given the scale, the size and scale of that aging populations will affect our society and economy going forward, this is really not enough. We need a more coherent and structured approach. Next slide, please. So what we recommend is an Aging Society New Deal, and we recommend that G20 leaders commit to developing national strategies with the following points. So firstly, we need to invest in health and recognise its economic value. We really need to increase spending on preventing poor health. That's particularly key. And we recommend doing this to at least 6% of health budget, as is done in Canada. So we know this is possible. But going forward, this needs to increase in line with the growth in preventable illnesses that are likely to increase as populations age. Secondly, we need to tackle health inequalities and prioritise and tailor health interventions for disadvantaged groups. We also need to factor in health and inclusion when measuring growth. So really take into account that link between health and wealth when making decisions. And we could do this by complementing GDP with a measure like, for instance, the Inclusive Development Index that factors in health and inclusion. And this does this, for instance, by including a measure of healthy life expectancy as a measure of growth and development. Second, we need to support work in an aging and changing world. And that involves incentivizing employers to reduce the barriers to working in later life. And to give you an example, in Australia, they're actually offering subsidies to employers that hire older workers. And that is to tackle age discrimination, which is, although illegal, it is still prevalent in a more subtle form. We also need to ensure that new technologies support all workers, including older workers, and to be more productive and augment their productivity and not displace them. And I think the emerging new technologies have a real potential to support aging populations, but we need to ensure that the right incentives are in place for this. We also need to support and empower all generations to have fulfilling and longer working lives. So that could involve removing any regulatory barriers to this, like a mandatory retirement age, and offering support where necessary. So to give you an example, in Japan, they're offering targeted unemployment support to older workers, and we're seeing that they have really high employment rates at all ages. We also need to invest in lifelong learning. There's some really interesting examples of this happening in Russia and the US, to support older people to gain skills throughout the life course. And this is really important to support productivity, particularly as new technologies rapidly develop, but also to ensure that people have the opportunity to take breaks, change direction, change careers, so to ensure that they're fulfilled while they're working for longer. And that's really important to support well-being and fulfillment, and not just longer working lives. Next slide, please. Thirdly, we need to unlock the opportunities to tap into older people's growing power as consumers. So that could involve developing strategies to support businesses to capture an aging consumer market. And we're seeing those strategies being developed in the EU right now. So that's something we can learn from. And that could involve supporting or incentivizing innovators and existing businesses that wish to adapt. We also need to reduce barriers to spending in local communities. So that could involve making our transport more inclusive and age-friendly, our town centres more age-friendly, and also encouraging local businesses to adapt. And there's some really interesting initiatives of this going on in Greater Manchester, which is the UK's first age-friendly city region. And finally, we need to recognise and support unpaid contributions. We can't forget these. And so we need to regularly be measuring these, but also measuring their value to society and the economy. And South Africa is a good example of this, where they measure volunteering. They've been doing that for years, but also the value of volunteering to society and the economy. We also need to support informal carers and involved grandparents. And there's some really interesting examples going on here in Germany and Hungary, for instance, where parental leave can be transferred to grandparents. So ensuring that people have flexibility at work, and we know that's really valued. And finally, we need to enable and incentivize volunteering at all ages and remove any barriers to doing this. Next slide, please. So just to recap what we've been saying, we too often fixate on the economic costs of aging, but we find that the economic and social contributions of older adults by working, earning, spending, but also by generating unpaid contributions are significant and are growing as a population's age. But we can do more to maximize these. We find that good health is particularly key for this, and it can unlock all these contributions, both market activities and non-market activities. And we urgently need to invest in preventative health, and this is key to maximizing the link between health and wealth, that link we too often forget. And we also find that we're not doing enough to invest in preventative health, and also that aging policies are fragmented, and that's why we recommend an Aging Society New Deal. So finally, let's use that shift in mindset created by COVID to raise the funds today, to make our economies more resilient to COVID now, and to realise a longevity dividend tomorrow. We can't afford not to. Thank you. I look forward to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Sophia. Really, really great. And that's been 9 months' work from Sophia. And although I think we would say we're now just at the start, because actually this is the point we need to start talking to our some of the people we've got on the line today, and to policymakers about how we can deliver and maximise the longevity dividend. I should apologise, we don't have Andy Burnham, perhaps unsurprisingly given the weekend's news. Manchester is a great age-friendly city, and had he been here and not otherwise diverted by 10 Downing Street today, I'd be wanting to ask him about sort of how do we how do we maximize the longevity dividend in places like Manchester, where we know that, you know, a big growth area is transport and hospitality, but you've got a group of older people who are potentially very fearful of going out to work and continuing to spend. So, but sadly, Andy has been dragged away by 10 Downing Street. So I'm sorry about that. But I am, however, really, really pleased to be able to welcome the Honourable Dr. Mukisi, who is the Minister of Health in the Republic of South Africa. He's also the Minister for Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, medical doctor by background, and he's worked as a medical doctor in all sorts of places, from Zimbabwe to Swaziland. And I will stop there and pass over to Dr. Mukisi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the moderator, the Director for International Longevity Center, David Sinclair, Excellencies and fellow panelists. I hope I can be heard. Distinguished guests, thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this exciting opportunity to make contributions on to this important discussion on the merits of longevity dividend. The epidemiology of aging demands that we approach public health care and fiscal policies differently, such that we derive the most out of the rising population of older persons. As an African, deeply rooted in African culture, which reveres its elders, I'd like to make the argument that the longevity dividend has always been well appreciated since African antiquity. And indeed, even in modern times, our reality is that older persons, which we define as over 50 years of age, play a very critical role in the social fabric of our society, including their direct and indirect economic contributions. In South Africa, the historical legacy of high labor migration and non-marital childbearing has for a long time made many grandparents to be the primary caregivers of their grandchildren. This was later to be exacerbated by the HIV epidemic, which resulted in the upsurge of the adult morbidity and mortality with HIV progression, and childcare automatically fell on grandparents. Although there's an increased survival with the massive antiretroviral treatment rollout in the country, South Africa still has the highest number of HIV infections in the world and has seen a dramatic increase in AIDS-related deaths, which peaked around 2007. Stats SA in 2018 reported that grandparenthood presents a revelatory study that shows that our thinking around an aging population is premised on theoretical prepositions that are not based on reality. The household headship by grandparents remained largely unchanged, around 12% across the censuses of 1996, 2001, and 2011. And this is a percentage that cannot be ignored by the economy. Even more interesting, I was looking at what is called time used by older persons, which is expressed in average minutes on certain activities as compared to the younger persons, those under 50. Statistics South Africa has conducted 2 of such surveys, one in 2000 and in 2010, and they reported that to provide more recent information, the aim of the study is to provide in the information the way South Africans spend their time with the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action 2017, and it represents a sample size of 30,000 households. So this time use working establishment was 108 minutes, average minutes in older persons, and 178 in average minutes in younger person. And this time use in primary production was 24 average minutes in older persons as opposed to 12 average minutes in younger person. So the time use household management was 145 versus 141 from older person to the younger one. And on other social activities, it was almost a similar kind of pattern. We may not be able to analyze all these activities outlined in this report, but it's important to say that it does show that it represents a very important and critical component of our economy and direct contributions from the older persons as consumers and in their role as leadership and facilitators of social cohesion, which translate to multiply effect in the economy. And in most of the communities, the role of leadership in society, actually, there's a lot of difference to the older persons, mainly because of their experience and the fact that they keep a degree of calmness under the very strenuous conditions, which sometimes we've seen conflicts, and therefore they tend to have a very important role to play at that level. Some have even indicated to the extent to which they've gone all out to work as volunteers just to support communities where they become role models or they become a source of support for more than their own families in the villages, in the townships, in the vicinity. In a paper entitled "The Substantial Economic Returns from Delayed Aging May Warrant a New Focus on Medical Research," Olansky et al. Quantified the economic value of delayed aging to be estimated to $7.1 trillion over 50 years. It was their submission that greater investment in research to delay the aging process appears to be a highly efficient way to forestall disease, extend a healthy life, and improve public health. So the question should not be whether we should be investing into the health to deliver on our mandate of a long and healthy life for all, as we have promised our people in South Africa, but what should we be investing into, or not only promote longevity, but to mitigate against the effects of aging. Indeed, this is now one of the most exciting arenas in medical research and development. We have to accelerate the path to these solutions, lest we affirm that those who believe in an aging population is a fiscal burden. The reason is that the longer we live, the greater is the influence of biological aging on the manifestation of fatal and disabling diseases. As long as the rates of aging of our bodies continues without amelioration, the progress we make on all major disease fronts may eventually face a point of diminishing returns. We must get the fundamentals right. The rollout of universal health coverage is one of the utmost important goals to achieve. And for those of us who have not attained it, this is where our focus should be going in terms of our policy framework. Indeed, as we fought on COVID-19, so South Africa has taken opportunities in practice to begin implementing the tenets of our national health insurance. This is the instruments which will be used to roll out universal health coverage. Part of the discussions at the G20 level, where ministers of finance and ministers of health have always been brought together in the past couple of years, has actually emphasized the need for us to deal with this issue. And I've had to quote an example of Japan. They've actually been able to give us this kind of experience of how the longevity has been ensured by the introduction of universal health coverage. As alluded to previously, our case is one of the proudest success stories in the dramatic rise of the life expectancy as a result of the policy making to combat HIV pandemic. Our life expectancy rose from 53.7% in 2005 to 64.8 years in 2018, largely due to the antiretroviral program. But as a consequence of this, now South Africa is in the midst of a rise of non-communicable diseases as people are living longer. Cardiovascular diseases, cancers, hypertension, diabetes are now the concerns of the issues which begin to afflict them as we move on. And needless to say that both the treatment on HIV as well as the treatment of non-communicable diseases is increasing the burden on the resources needed in the health sector. These obviously are very significant contributors to the morbidity and mortality during the aging process. But fundamental to attaining universal health coverage, a strong primary health care system that ensures optimal health, ensures optimal health. It's a very important contribution for all community contribution that we need to make to support all communities. Integral to the primary health care is the promotion of preventative health strategies, good nutrition, enabling environment to exercise, recreation, creating awareness and motivation for proactive screening and testing of common and communicable diseases, and ensuring that there's good compliance to treatment. We have already started to put up senior citizens clubs. These are forums that meet literally every week where the senior citizens meet discuss social issues, support each other, and then start to be taught on basic problems of non-communicable diseases, mental health, cancers, heart and liver and kidney diseases, and all of this. And the result of this is that we've seen a huge improvement in compliance to all the chronic medication, and of course, the use of the understanding on the basic nutrition and support on some of the social issues. So that's become one of the very strong areas where we are able to get each one to be reinforced and support each other on the challenges that they face on the particular ailment that they might be going through. And so we do have now to focus on some of the scientific studies that have been done, and it's really encouraging to see studies on aging, which has shown that our bodies are inherently modifiable, and that the therapeutic intervention, the slows aging is also possible, which is a target for science and public health. And if we can target the biology of aging, we can delay age-related diseases. This can also save healthcare costs and add life to our years. And again, the example they were discussing around Japan was indicating the importance of primary healthcare, both in prevention of diseases, but also in rehabilitation of people who are already affected, with exercises necessary for arthritis problems and all of this. And in the process, it means therefore that a strong primary healthcare will be useful earlier on in life and later on in life, and it's something that we have to deal with. A lot of studies are being done in some of the institutions, such as University of Pretoria and KwaZulu-Natal, and private institutions. All of these are actually giving us new information on the issues of aging. In considering all the above, it is clear that there needs to be policy reforms, which are cross-cutting across various sectors and departments, which are health, finance, social development, education, trade, industry, labor, science and innovation. And lifetime other considerations such as lifetime savings are very, very important, where like pension funds would need to be adapted to people who are going to live much longer. And therefore, in the way that these policies are designed, they must allow for self-sufficient livelihood on the elderly for a long time, because they will not be suffering or maybe succumbing to some of the diseases. And government in South Africa is focusing on this, and has got a very strong social security network for those who are over 60, even those who are indigent and were not involved in gainful employment during their time. The older workforce comes, of course, with a wealth of experience, formal, technical, tacit skills, which can only be accumulated over a long service. Employers in sectors which are facing labor shortages are seeking to acquire such skills through programs such as mid-career apprenticeship. Here at home, for instance, we have had to recruit retired healthcare workers who contributed to an 18,000 strong healthcare worker recruitment drive to deal with COVID-19. Older workers transfer skills, share knowledge, and provide mentorship for the younger workforce to become even more productive. And many older people are also contributing to social welfare, taking on caring roles such as looking after grandchildren and elderly parents, as I have demonstrated in some of the examples which I've quoted. In conclusion, therefore, we should welcome this very important discussion to rethink the purpose and relevance of government policies in shaping a world that is more inclusive and protective of older persons, and looking at middle-income countries such that we enjoy the economic gains of the longevity dividend. And as we have heard, in some of the countries have started pushing up the retirement age, and they talk about this as one of the benefits that we have to look forward to. I therefore want to close by quoting a famous African proverb which says, and I quote, "The words of the elders do not lock all the doors. They leave the right door open." So let's not waste this treasure of having longevity and the wisdom and the contribution of the senior citizens in our society.
Great, thank you so much for that. That was brilliant, really, really good. And I think what it highlights is that the longevity dividend is not just about the G7. It's actually not even just about the G20. It's about the whole world. The whole world is aging, and you know the opportunities and challenges of longevity affect places like South Africa as well as places like Japan. So I think it's extraordinarily important we recognise that. I think your points about HIV were really, really pertinent and important. We published some work last year that showed that the number of years lived with a disability due to HIV by people aged 50 plus and this was in the better off countries, had increased over 200% between 1992 and 27, and were forecast to increase again by another sort of 85%. So we know there are also growing numbers of older people living with HIV, and that the focus on prevention of HIV is extraordinarily important, but also, as you recognise, I think throughout the important role older people play as carers of children and parents, you know, in the context of HIV, potentially even more important. So thank you so much for that. That was great. I'm going to now ask my colleagues to pass us over to our next speaker, who is Eric Hagen, who joined ILC at last year in Japan for an event we held alongside the G20 health ministers. So I'm going to ask my colleagues now to begin that. Okay, I think we may be struggling with Eric. Let's give my colleagues a couple of moments more. Sorry about this. My colleagues may what I might have to do, as we seem to have challenges with our video for now, is, and this is I'm hoping that this will be okay, is us jump on to Mark and Gustavo earlier than planned. Just hopefully that will be okay. I think Mark is with us, so perhaps we can do that. So if we could move on then to, we'll get Mark, and then hopefully we will get Eric and Dubrovka in a moment. So Mark is the Deputy Director for Employment, Labour and Social Affairs at the OECD. Mark also joined us at our event in Japan last year. So I will perhaps just immediately pass over to Mark to make his contribution. Sorry, Mark, for asking you to do this earlier than planned.
Not at all, David. It's a nightmare organising these things online, isn't it? And even as we speak, I see Dr. Hagen's mouth moving on screen. Would you like me to stop and have another chance with him?
Why don't we give it a go? Why don't we give it a go and see if we can get Eric speaking, and then we'll come back to you. Let's give it a go. Okay, sorry about that. No, I don't think we have the sound actually. So so Mark, why don't you start, and we will hopefully get our technology working soon. And I appreciate you also had some slides, didn't you, Mark? So this might be slightly, I think my colleagues are probably trying to sort that out now. Sound
Okay.
actually. So so
I'm
Mark,
Deputy Secretary
Mark,
Eric
why don't
Hargan
you
from the
why don't
United
you
States
start,
Department of Health and
and
Human Services.
we will hopefully get our technology working soon. And I appreciate you also had some slides, didn't you, Mark? So this might be slightly, I think my colleagues are probably trying to sort that out now. Sound
Okay.
actually. So so
I'm
Mark,
Deputy Secretary Eric
why don't you
Hargan from the United States
start,
Department of Health and
and
Human Services.
we will hopefully get our technology working soon. And I appreciate you. Sorry, Mark. I don't know what's happening here. So please do, Mark. Are you able to start without your slide, Mark?
Of course I am.
Sorry
Yes,
about
I
it.
can.
Sorry
I can
about it.
start.
I should say I've given you a terrible introduction, but I should say I do still remember that. So Mark came to our event in Japan, and Eric at the time spent quite a lot of time talking about sort of high tech interventions, and I remember sort of you talking about things like the digital divide and how we can make sure in a world of new tech which can support prevention that this isn't exclusive to those who have access to that technology. I hope I'm not putting my words in your mouth, but I think that was what you said. But anyway, Mark, let me pass over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Thank you very much indeed, Sophia. It was a fantastic presentation. I love the work you've done. I love the title, Healthy Equals Wealthy. Yes, health really doesn't have the status of factor of production that it deserves. And of course, it is obviously an end in itself, but it's also a means to an end, a wealthier, fairer society. And really our challenge is that when we talk about aging and health, immediately people's attention starts automatically going to what I have on the right-hand side of this panel, something about the health expenditure that's going to rise over the next 15 years. We think, this is our best estimate, the average for OECD countries, G20 countries, it's probably a little bit faster, the rise that we're expecting, though obviously the average is lower. The thing is, though, not much of that is due to aging. Most of it's due to other factors. Perhaps only a quarter of the increase that we project in increased in health spending is due to aging. And really the much bigger challenge, there is a challenge to our public finances that comes from population aging, but it comes from what's happening on the left-hand side. It comes from the fact that if we do not find a way to make sure that older people, and by older, I'll take your definition from your presentation and report really from 50 plus. If we don't have people 50 plus who are able to contribute to our economy and society, well, then we don't have as many people contributing to that increase in health spending, that increase in pensions that will inevitably come from aging. So we really need to turn around this argument. It's not that aging is a cost, it's that failure to adapt our societies and our labour markets and our public policies more generally to aging, that's going to be our real economic challenge in the future. And it's not just, of course, about work. Immediately I started talking about how many people are working or not working in the older age groups. But one of the most important numbers, I think, in all the work that I've been involved with for many, many years on health and aging is what's happening in the middle panel of this chart. We kind of automatically think that people in poor health don't work. But in fact, many people are working. People who are in fair, bad, or very bad health compared to people who are in good or very good health earn a lot less. And let me put this in context. If you look at that group of people, and these data are from Europe in general, the average across the European Union, and look at people who are low skilled. You ask any minister of finance, any prime minister, any president, they'll immediately start talking about how we must upskill people who are low skilled. And indeed, that has a big effect on their earnings. But in fact, if we move people who are in poor health and who are low skilled up to good health, then the increase in their earnings is over their lifetime is every bit as much as increasing their skill levels. In other words, somehow the education sector has managed to get ministries of finance, ministries of economic affairs, to understand that investing in education is an investment. But the rate of return to investing in better health can be equally good if you actually invest in health for the group that are the most vulnerable in our population. I think that's a very important point, and I think it's implicit in an awful lot of what you've put in your report. But of course, what do we do? That's the real challenge, and you spend a lot of your reports on that. On my next slide, I have a few options that I think are the most important. If we manage to move on to the next slide, I'm not sure we will, but if we do, then on the left panel, you've referred to this a lot. I mean, you made this big push to increase the amount of prevention spending up to 6% on average. Yeah, there's a huge potential from doing better in our prevention policies. I've got some figures there that you can see on obesity, but there are similar figures I could use if I started looking at things like smoking or even physical exercise. I think prevention is incredibly important. I would say that I also think that there's a lot more that we can do within the health system, even for people who do have chronic diseases. And maybe I'd put a little bit more stress on this than perhaps you did in your report. We know that sometime between 60 and 70, at the moment, a lot of people will develop chronic diseases. The past is the past. There's only so much we can do with prevention. But nevertheless, that's when really chronic diseases really take root. And you know, for the vast majority of chronic diseases, many of them, there's no reason why these should stop people playing a full role in life, in work. But too often, we don't do the simple things well. When I start looking at the number of people who are getting complications from diabetes, or whose asthma is not being dealt with properly, or who are finding depression something that they're not getting treated well enough. Those sorts of chronic diseases don't need new fantastic technological breakthroughs. They just need us to do what we know we can do and should do, and actually deliver it to everybody. And we don't do that well enough at the moment. Still, our health systems are more focused on immediately life-threatening interventions, rather than helping people who have their chronic diseases live their life as well as they could and be able to play a full role in society and the workforce. And I do have to just also mention, of course, again, it was in your report, but of course, there'll be a huge demand for the number of people who will need some sort of care over the next 15 years. And I find it interesting that when we talk about the building back better in COVID recovery, that there's an awful lot of focus on green jobs, and that's wonderful. I have absolutely no problem with a big investment in moving towards a circular economy. But even so, if we look at the numbers, it's still going to be the case that the number of new jobs in care will exceed the number of new jobs that are narrowly related to moving towards a circular economy and a more green economy in the future. Care is where the jobs will be appearing. And I think somehow we need to get that much more into the discussions that are going on at the moment about how we get out of the economic crisis that's come along with our COVID crisis. We need to start talking about the fact that there are all those jobs that we will need to see filled in the caring sector. Very briefly, if I can move on to my final slide and just talk about, of course, employment. You've mentioned it already, the barriers to getting people into employment. Somebody actually said in the chat something I think very relevant. It's not just about investing in health so that people can work longer. It's also about enabling people to stay in work, staying in reasonable quality jobs, because that actually is associated with them being in better health as well. It goes in both directions. And we still have some barriers there. We've made a lot of progress between the great financial crisis and up to the COVID crisis. We must make sure that we don't lose that progress as we come out of the COVID crisis. And even though we did much better in making sure older workers are remaining in employment, there's still structural barriers. We still didn't really get them to engage more in training. You can see the difference there. That's in G20 OECD countries. Younger adults are twice as likely to engage in training each year than older adults. And even when you look at new hires, it's obviously still very difficult for many older workers once they reach the age of 50, 55 to be re-employed. Somebody's already mentioned discrimination. Yes, it clearly exists. It also is about changing the way that we view our workforces away from being how many older workers, how many younger workers, to adapting to multi-generational workforces. And I think there's some fantastic work going on trying to think about how we construct those multi-generational workforces so that everybody benefits. I can't go on forever. There's so many other things I would love to say, but let me finish on a positive note. I mean, I do think we have made enormous progress over the years in the lives, the livelihoods, the status of older people. I've put some figures here on poverty rates, and you can see going back to the 1980s, poverty and old age were synonymous. I mean, or rather, if you were poor, you were almost certainly going to be old. It's a shame that poverty rates have risen significantly since the 1980s. But that said, you can see in that chart that the relationship between old age and poverty has certainly changed. I think that's a fantastic thing. Poverty rates are still too high, but better pensions, longer careers, especially for women, of course, have had a massive effect on the well-being of older people. We can still do an awful lot more, but I think those changes that are implicit in that chart, they have been due to policy changes. It shows that if we really want to make a difference to the lives of older people, we can if we get the policy settings right. Looking forward to the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. Lots and lots to come back to there, and particularly struck by your point about the number of care jobs being potentially more than those in the circular economy going forward, and that might be something. I see we've got a question in the Q&A around sort of climate change and longevity, so maybe we will want to come back to that. Please, again, can I encourage you all to add your questions into the Q&A. We are going to risk, I think, trying to do the videos again, so I'm going to perhaps Q&A around sort of climate change and longevity, so maybe we will want to come back to that. Please, again, can I encourage you all to add
I'm Deputy
your
Secretary Eric
into
Hargan from the United States
Q&A.
Department of Health and Human
we are
Services.
going to risk, I think,
and it's an honor to
trying
address you all today.
do
I'd like
the
to
videos
first
again,
thank the
so I'm going to
International
perhaps
Longevity Center for
Q&A
hosting this
around sort of
important
climate
event.
change and sorry about this. I think Gustavo, are you available still at the moment? Can I perhaps try and bring you in earlier? Is that possible? Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry about this. We're clearly having challenges with our tech, but let me come straight over to you, Gustavo.
All right.
So Gustavo, really delighted to welcome you here. He is the Pensions Global Lead at the World Bank. As lead economist, he's led the World Bank's operations on policy dialogue on pensions, social protections and labour across the Middle East and North Africa for more than 10 years. Gustavo, sorry for jumping you in so quickly.
That's okay. That's okay. No problem. And it's my pleasure to participate in this event and also welcome your publication, which I have not yet read, but I have very quickly gone through some of the highlights of this report. I find it really relevant, and I find it a very important publication, a very welcome publication. Now, I'm going to address a few considerations regarding the relevance of this agenda for the rest of the world, for the part of the world where the World Bank focuses, that is mainly on middle and lower income countries, and you know, there's there's a usual claim that the aging agenda is an agenda for higher income countries, for the more developed world, and that the rest of the world is not yet there. The rest of the world is still struggling with many countries are still struggling with a youth bulge, and try to maximize the youth dividend. So there's a lot of focus in the concept of human capital associated with maximizing the youth dividend, but at the same time, all the world is aging, and the poorer countries, the less developed countries, are aging faster than the rest of the world, in the sense that the process of aging is much faster in many of the less developed countries than it was in several of the developed countries in the past. There's also some claim, however, that cultural aspects, and particularly family networks, are quite specific in the developing world, and therefore many of the messages of the aging agenda that are relevant for G20 or for G7 countries are not relevant for the rest, and I would try to minimize this counter argument. But let me refer to the fact that the aging world will continue being the developing world will continue being challenged by income protection, and income protection for the elderly will continue to be a challenge, particularly in a world where more than 60% of the population is in the informal sector, and does not have even a minimum income protection from contributory or non-contributory social protection. This will continue to be at the center of the agenda, and will continue to be at the center of the agenda of the World Bank. So ensuring that that people in the old age will continue receiving income from contributory and non-contributory social protection programs will continue to be very important in the World Bank's agenda. Ensuring that this will happen in a sustainable manner, and that the redistributional impact of the social insurance programs will be progressive, and that regressivity will be minimized is another aspect that the World Bank will continue supporting. But at the same time, this entails some consequences on rethinking the entire aging agenda. So we have been claiming for quite a long time, and we have been discussing with many of our countries, that longer lives require longer working careers. And this has been part of our policy dialogue with all of the countries where the World Bank has been involved. But this, we have not given enough thinking to the conditions to make people remain employable for a longer time. That is, how to make sure that employment opportunities will continue will continue to be available for the older population, for the aging population, that people will be able to stay at work, that people will be able to have access to training programs and adult education to ensure their employability at older ages, and that they will be able to stay in work and active. This is not something that has to be taken for granted, I think, in most countries, but particularly not to be taken for granted in developing countries. So developing skills and adult education have to be quite central to the entire aging agenda. And financial inclusion is also an aspect to which the World Bank has given a lot of consideration, and particularly for the elderly, financial inclusion is very critical and very central. So overall, we can't take for granted that income protection is ensured for the elderly, but at the same time, we are very aware that this has to be complemented with a lot of delivery systems that need to be set in place, employment programs, and long-term care. Now, talking specifically about long-term care, we want to be quite specific with regard to the implications of the long-term care agenda. Few countries among the World Bank's client countries are asking the World Bank to support long-term care programs. And we are trying to make sure that this agenda becomes bigger and more important and more relevant. But this means some kind of rethinking the long-term care arrangement. So many countries think that what works in the G7 world, in the G7 countries, does not necessarily work in countries where the family networks are the principal providers of long-term care for the elderly. And there's nothing wrong about this. We don't find that we're not advocating, and I think after COVID-19, even some developed countries are rethinking the institution-based versus the family-based long-term care. And there may be some common thinking about how to maximize and improve the quality of family-based long-term care for the elderly, and particularly how to involve women in a productive manner. So we are trying to link through initially some small projects. We are trying to link the employment agenda to improve the employability of women with long-term care programs for the elderly, and we hope to be able to share some positive results and in the course of the coming months. COVID-19 has brought to the surface a number of urgent needs to focus on the social protection agenda. And a lot has been said about the role of cash transfers during the COVID-19 crisis and the role of unemployment insurance as social protection mechanisms. We claim that we have not seen, however, that the entire income protection for the elderly programs have been less, that there has been less traction. So we were wondering, I was wondering if we were going to be facing some kind of, focused attention to the non-contributory social protection agenda and a bit less attention to pensions and long-term care. This has not happened. So, policymakers are still very concerned about having sustainable programs to provide income protection and to be able to provide long-term care for the elderly. There has been, as I mentioned before, much less attention to the skills agenda to ensure the productive inclusion of older people in the labor force. But these are the challenges moving forward. So the COVID recovery, I am sure that it's going to be require more and not less attention to this entire agenda to support elderly income protection for the elderly. The risk of informality is now a bigger threat than it was in the past. Many pension systems in the world are being stretched by the fact that emergency needs have forced some countries to decide some schemes to decide to stop contributions or to give some contribution waivers, to offer contribution waivers for the pension schemes, and in few cases there have been early withdrawal of funds due to the emergency. So the long term is going to look even more challenging than it was before COVID. And is probably going to speed up the whole need to think of the relevance of the aging agenda. I think in this process, we have a lot to learn from this report. And I also invite the colleagues from OECD, G20 countries, to work together with us in some of the aspects of the long-term care agenda that I think will need to be reconsidered in view of the challenges that were faced by the traditional long-term care in the G7 countries and in the G20 countries during the COVID crisis. So my conclusion is that we will continue rethinking income protection. We will continue having the inclusion of the informal sector at the center of our agenda. We are trying to invest more, to spend more of our support to the long-term care agenda, to the employment agenda, and to the employability and skills development and financial inclusion agenda for the elderly. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And I think we're going to make one final attempt at getting our videos to start in a moment. I think your point about skills and education extraordinarily important. Some work ILC UK did a year or so ago, a couple of years ago, showed that there was a very strong relationship between productivity in an economy and not age, but actually skills. So actually the skills being within an economy were important, not the age of an economy in terms of the age of the workforce, in terms of the productivity of the workforce. One thing we might want to debate at the end is the extent to which the G7 are different from the rest of the world, or the G20 are, in the, I think one of the things that's striking to me is, yes, the care system in the G7 might be slightly different, but it's still undoubtedly the case that the vast majority of care provided in G7 countries is provided by informal carers, by volunteers, by family members. So actually across the whole world we see older and younger people providing very significant levels of care, but it's undoubtedly a global challenge that requires some global attention, which is why we really wanted to do this ahead of the finance ministers, to try and convince those to engage a little bit more in this space. I think my colleague's gonna give the video a go, and I think we're going to try and hear from Eric this time.
Greetings from Washington, D.C. I'm Deputy Secretary Eric Hargan from the United States Department of Health and Human Services, and it's an honor to address you all today. I'd like to first thank the International Longevity Center for hosting this important event. Thinking about how we can support healthy aging for Americans and people across the world is a top priority for the United States. This is especially true amidst a pandemic when the elderly are at higher risk for serious disease and death, and where we have to take significant precautions to protect older Americans that may be disruptive to their lives and their connections to their communities. The Trump administration has made it a top priority to protect vulnerable citizens in our country before and during this time of crisis, to ensure they have access to quality care, and to empower them to continue living healthy, thriving lives connected to the community. Today, I'll mention a few examples of how we're doing that, using telehealth to provide care more conveniently and safely for older Americans, and tackling impactable health challenges that can lead to debilitating conditions for older patients. On telehealth, from day one of the Trump administration, we've continually looked to innovate in the realm of healthcare because we know that only through innovation will we be able to unlock better health and longer productive lives for all Americans. That innovation focus is the mindset that led to such an aggressive rollout of telehealth flexibilities during this pandemic. Simply put, we knew that we needed to provide the space for healthcare providers to innovate. I think that in just months, we've really seen 7 or 8 years worth of progress on telehealth, and I'm excited to see the lasting effects of this culture change. What have we done to make this possible? Our Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has dramatically expanded the ability of Medicare to pay for telemedicine during the pandemic, beyond just rural areas, across the country. And the Office of Inspector General has provided flexibility for healthcare providers to reduce or waive cost sharing for virtual care paid for by federal healthcare programs. We've added 135 additional services that could be provided through telehealth, including emergency department visits, initial nursing facility and discharge visits, and therapy services. We've allowed Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries to receive telehealth from the comfort of their home instead of traveling to the nearest healthcare facility, which would sometimes be a facility quite far away. Our Office for Civil Rights has promised not to apply penalties under certain privacy laws to providers that use common and easy-to-use communication apps like FaceTime or Skype that otherwise wouldn't be compliant technologies for reaching their patients. The OCR guidance in particular has been one of the most transformative elements we've kept hearing about from providers because it allows patients and providers to use what makes sense for them. Since we took major steps around telehealth in March, we went from about 14,000 virtual visits in Medicare fee-for-service each week before the pandemic to nearly 1.7 million visits a week at the peak. So 14,000 to 1.7 million. We believe we cannot afford to go back to the status quo. The future gold standard of care integrates both in-person services and telehealth, customized around the patient's needs and their doctor's advice. As someone who grew up in rural America and has made rural health a focus of my time at HHS, I know this is a particularly exciting transformation that can have far-reaching effects for the elderly in rural areas, where it can be especially difficult for older Americans to access care. I now want to mention a couple of health areas where we're working to equip Americans with the information, the technology, and the tools they need to deliver better health, including on common challenges like hypertension, the risk of falls, and isolation. On hypertension, the United States Surgeon General, Vice Admiral Jerome Adams, recently launched a call to action to confront this major public health issue. Hypertension is a key national priority for so many reasons. More than 100 million Americans live with the condition, and it creates huge costs and burdens for our healthcare system. We also see significant disparities in the burden it places on Americans, with rates of associated conditions like stroke and heart disease much higher in Black Americans, for instance, than white Americans. This national campaign will increase awareness of hypertension as a key public health challenge and equip Americans with the information they need to tackle it. Part of the way we can make a difference on this challenge is by equipping individuals with the information and the tools they need to take care of their own health. For instance, self-monitoring your blood pressure is now part of the standard of care for hypertension, giving Americans a very personal way to help monitor their health and maintain it as they age. In the value-based healthcare system we're working toward in the United States, where we pay for health and outcomes rather than sickness and procedures, treating and preventing conditions like hypertension will be a top priority. And many of the tools that Americans need to help control hypertension can be provided at low or no cost because they save money in the long run. There are also new examples of technology emerging that make it even easier to track one's blood pressure. And technological innovation for older Americans is an area of interest for us more generally. To lay out a strategic framework for thinking about the promise of new technology and how it could positively impact aging populations, the White House has established a task force on research and development for technology to support aging adults. The task force published a report in March of last year identifying areas that are critical to individuals who wish to maintain their independence as they age, and where technology could have a positive impact. These areas include key activities for independent living, cognition, communication, and social connectivity, personal mobility, transportation issues, and access to healthcare services. On all of these fronts, we're thinking strategically about how we can support R&D for technologies that will help older citizens live healthier lives. Our focus on preventive measures in healthcare perhaps has no better example than how HHS has worked to prevent falls, which is a good example of how preventive efforts can help address what we don't necessarily think of as a health issue, but that all of us with older relatives know can be a serious problem that can lead to rapid deterioration of health and loss of independence. It happened in my own family with my grandmother. According to our colleagues at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, falls are the #1 cause of injuries, as well as death, from injury among older Americans. In fact, nearly every 11 seconds, an older American is treated in an emergency room for a fall-related injury. The total medical cost to treat older adult falls is in excess of $50 billion. That is a meaningful chunk of our healthcare spending devoted to such a simple, potentially preventable injury. And that's even before we get into accounting for the possible economic losses that could accrue from the contributions that someone older may be able to make until they have a serious accident, like a fall. But there's good news. We know that low-cost, high-impact, evidence-based health promotion programs have been proven to help prevent falls and mitigate fear of falling, which is actually a key risk factor for falls. HHS plays a direct role in this work because we're home to the Administration for Community Living, or ACL, which helps communities and individuals across America implement useful interventions that support the health and well-being of older Americans and Americans with disabilities. When it came to falls, ACL took the research conducted at places like the National Institutes of Health and the CDC and began replicating those efforts through local community-based organizations across America, known as the Aging Services Network. Our data tells us that the programs we've supported have made a huge positive difference in preventing falls. Prior to participation in our programs, 15% of participants reported having one or more injurious falls in the past 3 months. Following completion of our programs, this was reduced to only 5%. 89% reported that participating in the program reduced their fear of falling, and 98% said they felt more comfortable increasing their physical activity, which is a great step for prevention of other health issues and the ability to maintain independence and potentially continue contributing to the economy as well. What I've described over the past few moments is a picture of what it looks like when we address the needs of our citizens, especially our aging citizens, in a person-centered way, seeing ways to foster innovation in their healthcare, empower them and their communities to take ownership of their own health, and provide simple, common-sense solutions that not only save lives, but also taxpayer funds. All of these efforts can help make us not just a healthier society, but a wealthier one. As we all know from the title of this event, these two are inextricably connected. Generally, we think about how a healthier society will also be a wealthier one, but it's not a one-way street. A wealthier society can also afford to be a healthier one. HHS has a $1.3 trillion budget, and that's only possible because our society is wealthy enough to afford it, to afford the world's most technologically advanced healthcare system, the world's largest biomedical institution at NIH, the world's most generous bilateral global health partnerships, and more. We've seen during COVID-19 how economic dynamism has supported important elements of the American response to COVID-19, which will have benefits for the whole world. The United States has now invested more than $10 billion just in the development and manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines through Operation Warp Speed. We've had more than 250 different diagnostic tests from private companies, academic centers, and other sources receive emergency use authorizations from the FDA. The only way we have a private sector that can respond the way ours does, benefiting the whole world, is because our society is wealthy enough. In other words, HHS recognizes that fostering prosperity and enhancing and protecting health are two sides of the same coin. And we know that is true in terms of keeping our older citizens both healthy and prosperous too. What I've described for you today is what the future of healthcare can look like for aging populations if we have the courage to put them first and act accordingly. President Trump and his administration is committed to this effort, and I invite you all to join us in this endeavor to improve the health and prosperity of older citizens all over the world. So thank you again for inviting me to address you all today.
Great. Eric, it was great to hear Eric Hargan talking about the inextricable links between health and wealth. I think, you know, in the report, certainly we have found that. And I think one of the things we have been very conscious of is a desire, you know, in a world of COVID where the portrayal is that, you know, we are protecting health to, you know, that there has been a damage to our wealth as a result of protecting health. I think it's extraordinarily important that what we do is emphasize that actually without us all maintaining health, we won't have the wealth in the first, you know, we won't be able to maintain the sort of wealth we want. Now we are going to try, hopefully the tech will deliver us, and have our contribution from Dubravka Shuica, who is the Vice President for Democracy and Demography at the European Commission. She was a member of the European Parliament between 2013 and 2019, and is leading the European Commission are doing a couple of really interesting things in this space, including, for example, a planned green paper, which we're expecting to see in the next couple of months. Let's see if we can get the video going.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, what we are discussing today is people's lives and how long, productive and healthy those lives are. If we are lucky, we will all experience being elderly. The European Union's respect for the indivisible, universal values of human dignity, freedom, rights, socially, politically, this is where healthy equals wealthy. Enjoying these rights throughout the whole life cycle from birth to death and ensuring opportunities and fairness for all generations is the focus of my role as Vice President of the European Commission for Democracy and Demography. Our work on demography shows that our union is aging. We need to have a conversation about the challenges and opportunities this brings. The Commission's recent report on the impact of demographic change contributes to this by providing a fact-based reference for future policy making. Addressing demographic change is key to building a fairer and more resilient society. Indeed, addressing change means finding new solutions and stimulating innovation. We must find different ways to respond to the needs and talents of our citizens, to establish trust, solidarity. Knowing the impacts of demographic change contributes to this at all levels, local, regional, national, and European. We see how COVID-19 is creating unprecedented challenges for our health, our economy, and our social well-being, and highlights the importance of addressing demographic changes. First, the virus has not hit every member state in the same way. Secondly, it has not hit men and women in the same way. Thirdly, it has not hit the young and the elderly in the same way. A better understanding of a country's demographics, its age structure, its population, concentrations, household structures, or intergenerational interactions helps inform policy responses, not least in how we recover from this health and economic crisis. Indeed, in the current COVID-19 context, it is necessary to discuss the difficult issues of social isolation and mental health. Our recent report on the impacts of demographic change highlights these issues. The current pandemic has brought the issue of loneliness out into the open. Loneliness must be addressed in terms of the global longevity dividend. COVID-19 has helped everyone realize the importance of putting older people and their needs at the center of policy making at all times. In early 2021, we will present a green paper on aging with the aim of launching a wide debate to discuss the long-term impacts of aging, care and pensions, active aging, and the capacity of social protection systems to deal with an aging population. We will look at intergenerational solidarity and fairness, impacts on the labor market, the economy and health, and care systems. We will look at how the prospect of longer life expectancy can impact choices that are made by younger people. Let me be clear, aging concerns all generations, not just the elderly. Our green paper on aging is needed because Europe is an aging continent. In addition, people are living longer lives. Given these twin developments, a broad debate on how best to manage this good news is required, because it is good news. Over the last 50 years, life expectancy at birth has increased by 10 years for both men and women. Living longer in better health is one of the highest expectations of citizens of the European Union. This brings challenges and opportunities for us all, including older persons. There is no need to paint the elderly as victims. Many are active, healthy members of society who volunteer, support families, or care for grandchildren. During the pandemic, older doctors came out of retirement to help the overwhelmed health sector in various countries. The elderly have a lot of knowledge and experience to share. Let us consider intergenerational training programs from which we can all benefit. Let us harness the potential that goes with the elderly being a category that is a significant economic driver. With an increase of chronic diseases, professional staff shortages, and the growing demand for accessible, good quality services, we must discuss revamping long-term care systems in view of the rising long-term care needs and future health crises. The emerging silver economy provides opportunities for the health and long-term care sectors. It can be a driver of innovation and research, enable SMEs and startups to launch new ICT solutions, and produce highly skilled tech jobs. Approached this way, the silver economy can be a driver for employment and the economy more generally. I want to dwell a few moments on active aging because it means growing older in good health, it means continuing as a contributing member of society, and underpins the rights of the elderly. It also means keeping healthy, volunteering, helping the family. It can mean grandparents looking after grandchildren when adult children are working, a beautiful example of intergenerational solidarity. Children are also our future, and we are preparing a new comprehensive European Union strategy for the rights of the child, so we work on the full life cycle. Active aging also means participating in our democracy. For example, in local communities and municipal councils. As Vice President with responsibility for democracy and the Conference on the Future of Europe in particular, I look forward to hearing the voices of the elderly in our deliberations. Active aging also means being able to fully participate in society. Today, we inhabit a digitalized world. Digitalization and technology helps older people in their autonomy and ability to connect with others. It also raises issues on the right to privacy. This calls for action in increasing digital literacy for older people. Digital tools must be accessible and easy to use for all ages. Let us not forget intergenerational solidarity. It is a matter of fairness and equity that policymakers cater to the needs of all generations in a sustainable way. Enhancing the active and positive role of older people in our society is key to addressing aging. In July, European leaders agreed to a package of 1.8 trillion euros, which combines the next multi-annual budget and Next Generation EU. The latter provides us with the means to address the consequences of the pandemic, but it is also a call on future generations to help us to cope with the challenges of the present day. Dear ladies and gentlemen, if we learn one lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic, let it be the importance of solidarity. This will be one of the key messages in the Commission's Green Paper on Aging, which will launch a much-needed debate on all aspects of aging and will look into how we can and should respond. We can see already that a more comprehensive approach is required, addressing economic resilience and healthy and active aging. Indeed, this is where healthy equals wealthy, where everyone can share in the richness of life in all senses of the term richness, where the young, the old, and everyone else in between contributes to true solidarity, which is a two-way street as we look to our common future. Thank you.
Great. That again, it's great to see the European Commission focusing on the long term. For those of you who attended the launch of our UK report last year, you'll remember we had the UAE in attendance, and they were talking about the fact that they were planning a 50-year plan. You know, actually, I think one of the messages from ILC is actually we need to start planning for these challenges, which are inevitable, but with the right sort of leadership and right public policy, we can overcome them. So we've got about 25 minutes for questions. Please do put your questions into the Q&A box. Delighted that we still have our minister with us. We have Mark, we have Gustavo, we have Sophia still with us here on the chat, and I think I'll perhaps split the questions into a few different areas. So, and maybe the first thing is first point to make is in the sort of relationship between health and work, which we've emphasized quite a lot in the report. I suppose that there is a point or question in the Q&A that argues that, of course, good work is potentially good for the economy, but to what extent? But there is an extent to which poor quality work, poor quality employment opportunities can be bad for our health. I suppose it'd be interested to hear from all of the participants sort of a reflection on that, perhaps starting with Sophia, the extent to which if we turn the argument around, does it look very different? And then perhaps again, the extent to which what can we do about that? So Sophia, have you got anything you'd like to add in terms of that?
Yeah, thank you, David. Yes, so I think that's a really, really good point, and we have mentioned that in the report, so I think thanks for raising it. And that is why we think, so if you support people to not just work for longer, but to have fulfilling longer lives, that's the only way we can reduce health costs, because otherwise, if people are working in poor quality jobs, like you mentioned, that can be detrimental for health. So it's a really, really important point, and I think we have this opportunity as our populations age to have kind of two directions here, to support people to work for longer and fulfilling longer working lives, or to people to kind of be forced to work in jobs that are poor quality, which could be really detrimental for health. And again, that would have fiscal implications. So the kind of way we suggest in the report, for instance, is that recommendation. And one of the ways to do that, I think, is potentially to invest in lifelong learning. And it's that idea of that kind of multi-stage life is potentially a really good way to support people to not just work for longer, but to be fulfilled at work, because that can enable people to potentially change jobs if they're not happy at work. We know that education is actually really related to having good quality work in later life, and that can be a key reason why people choose to work for longer, because they generally enjoy working if they're able to gain those skills and to gain that education. And so I think lifelong learning is really key there. and also enabling people to work part-time and to have flexible hours, again, given all the kind of considerations around care and other kind of difficulties that occur in later life. That can also be really important to support well-being and to ensure that people are not just working for longer, but are being fulfilled at work.
Thanks, Sophia. It's great. And Dr. McKeesey, is there more that could be done that could usefully be done in terms of ensuring a good quality jobs for people in old age in South Africa and beyond?
Well, I think firstly, your point about the kind of work that people are involved in, does have a huge impact to the extent to which they are able to survive and their life expectancy. The kind of work which exposes a lot of people to debilitating conditions. We have a number of people who've died and who have lost their lives early because of the exposure, particularly you're looking at the environmental pollution issues around the mining setting. For example, we're dealing with huge compensation that's going back now to people who were debilitated much earlier and were exposed to tuberculosis, and we have to continue treating them, and we have to also look at compensation for them because they now need more assistance as a result. Then, of course, the other points, the issues of the job satisfaction is a big issue. The question of the stress, mental health issues related to the circumstances under which people work would determine whether they actually have to retire early, and therefore they have to deal with a lot of continuous, psychological or even mental health type of problems, as it were. I think it's supposed to be seen as a continuum, because what you do earlier will affect the outcome later. So if we can prevent diseases early, if we can encourage early control of some of the diseases, early treatment, early screening, it allows space for the person to have a much longer life and a much more comfortable life. So I think there is a lot to be done to look at how to ensure that the good quality work is ensured earlier as part of preventing deteriorating life conditions later on in life. And this is something that we have to continue to engage ourselves on. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Mark, the OECD, do you have sort of a take on how we can improve the quality of work and how that might support sort of healthy aging? Mark's still on mute. Let me move to Gustavo. Gustavo, do you have a view on this issue?
Well, actually, my view is that there is, in fact, a strong connection between health and work, but we put the working longer objective at the center of the aging agenda, and this links with health, with education, and with income protection. So the four aspects, I would expand in my answer the connection between work and health, and put work productively and work formally, and finding solutions for the inclusion in the formal labor force of the younger and the older workers, and its links with health, with lifelong learning or education, skills development, and income protection. I think that the four things go together.
That's great. I think very relevant. Let me perhaps sort of move on to a slightly different way. We've got a question from John Godfrey, who's asking what, and again, I'll perhaps go to our Minister McKeesey first. What more could and should businesses be doing to promote health and therefore wealth in South Africa, Minister?
I think that it's important to kind of have a policy that allows that at a workplace there should be early screening of diseases and checking people regularly to ensure the health status is maintained. So once in a year, for example, like we do for most people, you want to check if they don't have exposure to heart diseases, to cancers and so on, stuff that is preventable, because you can intervene quite a lot earlier in situations where people could be suffering from something that could be discovered much later. Many years ago, I recall we even had a situation where somebody worked in a clinic, but for 22 years they worked in the clinic, but in the process they had missed out on a simple basic message about screening on pap smears, and she died of a cancer of the cervix. And now these are examples of a lot of people can actually have their life improved by workplace related screening testing programs, which should be standardized. And in this case, I think it's something that becomes important, because when people don't have debilitating symptoms, they are prioritizing income, looking out for income for their families, rather than going out to do routine tests. And so many of the people would not use the time they have to go into a hospital just to check in case something is wrong with them when they don't feel any problem, and until it's too late. And so many of the diseases are silent killers that would progress in a body without having any symptoms until it's too late. Now, all of this becomes more of a problem for the low-income people who have to spend a long time on the transport, long hours of work, come back late, and then go back to work the following day. So there isn't time to actually focus on themselves. And this is one thing that really could be looked at. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I think we've got Mark back. Mark, what do you think businesses could do? Could businesses do more? What more could they do to promote health and wealth across our life course and into old age? I think we've come to the conclusion there's a very strong role in terms of skills and lifelong learning, but does business have a role in terms of health as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we've realized more and more, that obviously anybody who's managed large teams knows that once you have a staff member who is not capable of fulfilling their functions because they're sick for whatever reason, the consequences on productivity of the whole team is very large. And yet, generally speaking, employers have been reluctant to get more involved in the health system. And of course, there's understandable reasons why that is the case. And I'm not suggesting that we should be looking at employers creating parallel health systems. But in certain areas, I think they can do much more. I think understanding the needs of people with chronic diseases, first of all, and being a little bit more flexible about what might be needed for somebody who does have chronic diseases. Instead of seeing this as a negative, I think it needs to be seen as just one of those inevitable things. As our workforces get older, we will have lots more people who actually do have some sort of disease, and we don't want to lose them out of the workforce, and employers shouldn't lose them out of their own workforce, because they have much to offer. I think that can be said and doubled and even tripled when we start talking about mental health issues, where I think clearly employers have an awful lot that they can do. The stigma around mental health is an enormous barrier to actually treating it more effectively in our health systems and our societies. And much of that stigma comes from the fear of what a person's employer thinks about somebody with mental health. So I think that's certainly worth mentioning. I think I referred to something earlier, and I saw it came up in chats as well, about work that's been going on, that's been initiated by AARP in the United States, which I think is really interesting, which is to try, instead of looking at what do we need to do for older workers and treating them as, you know, a problem group almost, instead is to start looking at generational workforces and think about how employers should be managing their workforces better in the future, given that there's going to be many more people who are going to be older, many more people who are going to be close to retirement. How do you actually construct the transfer of knowledge between the generations? How do you create teams which are dynamic, capable of using the new technologies and new approaches, and take account of all that knowledge that many of the older workers also have? And I think that moving the discussion on beyond looking at older workers as a problem group to be addressed, but rather multi-generational workforce is an extremely interesting approach. And that's something I certainly think employers need to do a lot more of.
Great, thanks, Mark. And Gustavo, does the World Bank have a view on the role that businesses have to play in this space?
Yes, of course. I think as everybody knows, we as bank mostly work with governments, but we support partnerships, and we have a vision that when we talk about policies, we do not talk about we not only talk about public policies or policies that involve direct action of governments, but basically that have a space for public-private partnerships. So we have as probably some of the participants may be familiar with the cascading approach that the World Bank has adopted, that basically means what the private sector can do, let the private sector do first, and let the public sector and the support of the public policies come after the private sector shows the need of complementing the programs with public policies.
Great, thank you very much. I think we've got time for one final question, then perhaps some final comments. So there's quite a few points in the Q&A about the challenges of inequalities, and how do we ensure that, for example, preventative treatments are accessible to all, that we ensure that the sort of benefits of longevity reach all. So I wonder if sort of our panel, and perhaps I'll start with who should I start with? I'll start with perhaps Mark actually this time. How do what is there one or two things that governments can be doing to ensure that we are addressing perhaps some of the inequalities that we see in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy?
I think to say one or two, unfortunately, isn't going to be the answer. Our inequalities, by the time that we reach people who are approaching retirement age, those inequalities are already there. And yes, we can still do a fair bit at that point to, if you like, mitigate the impact of those inequalities, to cope with the inequalities that are already there. And I'm thinking in particular about looking at some of the aspects of our pension systems, particularly pensions as regards women who may have incomplete working careers, but some other groups as well. I think there's bits that can be done there, and there's probably more interest in many countries about doing something about those sort of gaps in social protection now than there was this time last year, because gaps in social protection have been shown throughout our social protection systems to be such a factor in how well we've managed to deal with COVID. So I think there is some interest in looking at those gaps. But the real challenge to tackling inequality in older age must be to tackle inequality in younger ages. And that, unfortunately, does require a multifaceted, multi-sectoral approach. Certainly, it involves addressing inequalities in education. But I think what we should have stressed in a meeting like this, and I think you've done it well in your report, is those inequalities in how we address lifestyle issues very early on. I mean, that the prevention spending there, yes, we need to do better at making sure the prevention spending is effective for people from lower socioeconomic groups than it currently is. But we do have a reasonable amount of evidence on what we can be doing there. It's just that often we do immediately reach for the simple things, for the, I don't know, for the apps, for the gym membership, for things that actually don't appeal very much to the lower socioeconomic groups. But there are still things in terms of changing initiatives in order to improve the, reduce the fat content, for example, of fast foods and so on, would have a very equalizing effect in terms of our prevention policy. So there are things that we can be doing in earlier age in the health system as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark. I'm going to ask Dr. McKeesey if he wants to come in on sort of how, you know, what more can be done in terms of addressing inequalities in access to health and prevention.
Well, thank you very much. I think, you know, it just does depend on the type of society that you're living in. The issues of inequality and poverty actually are linked to a whole host of other problems which go beyond the health, you know, provision or health department. And I think underlying all of that is the question of access to quality health care by all, irrespective of their ability to pay and presence of any medical insurance. And I think the route towards universal health coverage becomes a very, very important contribution here, because it begins to be an equalizer when it comes to the health issues. It allows everyone to have access to health care based on the need rather than on their ability to afford. And that would be a major issue insofar as most of the low-income countries, and it's an area that we need to focus. But linked to that, I think, is a whole host of other socio-economic development issues that relate to social safety nets, the questions of you know, housing. You get a lot of elderly who lose their ability to maintain a home and need you know, protective, supportive care. And then you also have issues of water, sanitation, which are a challenge. So a number of elderly have to now face the huge bills for water availability and so on. And then the issues of food security, the pension that governments can provide and that what employers can provide goes a long way here towards securing, you know, a stable, you know, situation in relation to security. And of course, issues of energy, where the extremities of temperatures during winter times, the problems of exposure to cold and associated complications becomes an issue there. So I would say that it does actually go back to fundamental socioeconomic issues of development and the access to quality healthcare as the basis of which you can create a platform which aging can therefore be managed better and can actually improve you know, longevity because of those supportive development issues. Thank you very much.
Great, that's great, and I certainly agree. I think that the importance of universal healthcare should not be undermined here at all. It's an extraordinarily important and necessary tool, I think, to tackle some of the inequalities. I'm going to ask our panel for final comment, perhaps finishing with Sophia. You know, a final observation on health equals wealth, and you can use this to give a message to the audience here, or you know, how can we all work together to address some of the challenges and maximize the opportunities we've come across today, and perhaps starting with Gustavo.
All right. I think, I mean, if I'm allowed to take the last discussion about inequality and the implications for the long term, for the lifelong social protection systems, the way the systems are built, I think the discussion about aging and inequality and the policies and the public policies has to be related with in most of the developing countries with the extension of social protection for all, and with social protection in an integrated manner, and with the role of delivery systems in the provision of different components of the social protection agenda, particularly those on aging. So let me just highlight once more the importance of the inclusion agenda, the importance of the informality agenda. We are spending quite a substantial amount of effort recently in the recent couple of years, in the past couple of years, to try to address the issue of informality and the issue of extending the coverage of social protection. It's been observed that the traditional social protection in the developing countries has not been able to expand substantially the outreach, and the informal sector today, the percentage of people who are not covered, elderly people who are not covered by social protection, is about the same as it was 20 years ago. So we have observed in a number of countries, statistically, empirically, we have observed that the coverage rates are pretty much the same. And this is why we are responding with an integrated views of social protection, if I'm allowed to advertise our Protecting All recent publication of the World Bank, which brings some new ideas about risk sharing for a diverse and diversifying world of work. And and also our delivery systems source book, which also has the World Bank views on the reforms in delivery systems that are needed to promote a better life for all at all ages.
Great, thank you very much. Mark, your final sort of observations or thoughts, challenges, takeaways?
Well, I thought it was very interesting that, of course, the reason why we've had this meeting today is that you're linking this to the G20 discussions. And of course, the G20 has talked about the silver economy and aging in the past. It had in 2015, it came up with the G20 principles on the silver economy and active aging. 2019 with Japan, it had many activities on aging and declarations around aging. So if you like, at the G20 level, there's a certain amount of interest there, but there's an element as well. I think up to now, the discussions have been a little bit tick box, if you know what I mean. Yeah, everybody thinks aging's important, tick it, move on to something a little bit more controversial. And I think I see your effort here as being very valuable, because it is trying to say, don't just treat this as something that we all agree is rather important, but something that's much more central to our political future. Because after all, we do have a once in a generation event going on at the moment. At least we certainly hope it's a once in a generation health event. May well not be, but it almost certainly is a once in a generation stimulus package that's likely to come at the end of this crisis as countries try and get their economies going. After all, given our debt levels, there's unlikely to be any significant effort in the future on the scale that we're about to see in order to get our economies going. So this is where you're going to see a big reorientation of public spending coming in the next few months and years. And I think this is the point that we really do need to make sure that we do talk about aging, and we don't just get hung up that somehow all our future is going to be about moving to a carbon neutral economy. Great, I've said this before in my presentation, absolutely we need a carbon neutral economy. But aging is there as well. It is something that we can't ignore as a challenge to our economies and societies. And we're not there yet. And I think your reports and your efforts should be seen in that context of trying to make sure that we do make sure that our political and economic efforts as we get out of this crisis give equal status to dealing with population aging as they do to moving towards a green economy. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark. And I think one of the points we make in the report is that one of the recent G20 summits, the leaders made 9 politically binding commitments on aging, but this is 9 of the 2,500 that they've made over the years. So, you know, it's nice to see them getting interested, but clearly there's a long way to go. Minister McKeesy, your final comments from you?
Thank you very much, David. I would also agree with with my fellow panelists here. To start off with, I think we need to congratulate the ILC for this very interesting discussion, and that should be the first point. And that is, we need to keep the discourse going. We need people to be discussing it. We need to be able to focus on awareness in society about the issues that are associated. We need to be dealing with issues of promotion of healthy lifestyles. We need to be focusing on research that relates to longevity, related conditions. So it takes us back to the question of policy formulation, because the question of longevity and long life or long life expectancies is an outcome of a complex set of policy choices, which have to include a number of principles, such as the principles of inclusivity, principles of the development agenda, and at the end of the day, we have to have other targeted programs, and in this case, programs such as for social protections, health policy issues. I think at the end of it, we need to understand that you will need a number of aspects to be attended to: health aspects, environmental issues, economic issues. The business needs to say, shouldn't say that's an issue for government. Everyone is involved here, and of course political. This is government, this society, all in all together. And the conclusion being that investment in a healthier population is what will give us longevity and longer life expectancy and good quality of health. But once you do so, then you have actually made a huge investment in economic growth, and therefore the two are inseparable. And then we need to move from the point of view that a healthier population will give us a better economy, and that combination allows us now to move together and try and align all the work that we do. I would say that at the end of it, that consideration needs to be, it's not just about health, because you then start seeing health as an expenditure. It's about an investment in what it takes to build a vibrant economy. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you again for joining us. I should have said we do have ILC UK is one of 16 ILCs, and we do have a very active ILC in South Africa, based in Cape Town University. So. And they were one of the early members of the ILC Global Alliance. Let me finally pass on to Sophia for a couple of sort of final observations before we close. Sophia?
Thanks, David. And thanks everyone for your presentations. They were really, really interesting. So I've got a lot of food for thought. So yeah, I guess kind of key points, really what we're finding is that and a lot of panelists were saying that, the contributions of older adults are significant, and how health is really key to untapping all of these, and that we really don't focus enough on that link between health and wealth, and really trying to consider, how can we do that in more of our decisions when we're choosing to invest in wealth and across policies more generally. So in cost benefit analysis decisions, again, talking about how we measure GDP, but really just thinking about that link much more going forward, and really highlighting that investing in preventative health is an investment and it will pay for itself. And finally, it's really how to, how can we convince governments, I think that came up in the Q&A, to do this and to prioritize health and preventing health. And I guess really linking it back to COVID, that there might be an opportunity now. I mean, it's a huge tragedy, but because that link has really been exposed, and we do need to use that because we might not have such a unique moment going forward. So I think that's really key. And I just think, finally, I just wanted to touch upon that point around aging and climate change. And I thought that was really interesting, and it was mentioned in the Q&A. And I guess kind of, as everyone has been saying, really, that obviously, if we don't invest in mitigating climate change, it will be disastrous for us all as we age. So of course, we can't ignore that. And it's really great to see governments acting more now on that. But obviously, if we don't try and maximize the longevity dividend, we might not have substantial government revenues to try and invest in mitigating climate change. We might have labor shortages, so insufficient numbers of people being able to work on doing some of these investments. And so it's really important that we do both. And I think finally, there are a lot of investments where it would be much more efficient if we think about both at the same time. So to give you an example, if we're making town centres more inclusive and making them more environmentally friendly, why can't we be considering both at the same time? Also with housing, if we're making that more inclusive to people as they age and also making them more environmentally friendly, can we make sure we're doing that at the same time? Because if we do one now, one later, it'll be much more expensive, and they're both really, really important issues. So I hope we can consider how can we join those up together in the most efficient way.
Great, thank you very much, Sophia. And again, thanks so much to all of our speakers and for all of you for joining us at the launch today. I think for me, there are 3 key points. One, that we have this narrative around aging and longevity, that aging is bad, it's going to cost more, it's going to cost society more, it's going to offer significant economic harm. So we have that narrative. Secondly, I think what we've shown in the report, that there is already a big economic return from longevity, that actually that narrative need not be true, that through work, through volunteering, through care, through spending, older people are already contributing significantly to the economy. And then thirdly, actually, this contribution could be much more significant if we invest in health, and in particular invest in prevention. It's very striking the impact of investing in prevention on promoting the economic contributions of this age group. So thanks again to all of our speakers. Thanks particularly also to Sanofi and Legal & General for supporting our work. The full report is on our website, and we will share a link. This, as I said at the beginning, is the starting point, and we're going to be talking this week to G20 leaders, to employers, and then over the next couple of weeks talking to marketing agencies, trade associations. Be really keen to have all of you involved in this and helping us get the message out. So please do get in touch with my colleague Lily Parsi. All our future webinars and our events are all on our website, and you can also find details on our Facebook and Twitter pages. Please, again, any final comments, put them onto our Twitter, with the hashtag longevity dividend. And finally, a couple of announcements. On the 16th of November, we are launching a new report on the non-financial benefits of financial advice, and we will send some invites out for that. And then secondly, our Future of Aging conference is taking place on the 3rd of December. For more information on that, go to www.futureofaging.org.uk. Thank you all so much again for joining us, and we hope to see you at another webinar in the future. Thank you.